If you know me, you know that I'm a big jazz boy. I've got the clickhole quiz results and video evidence to prove as much. I mention this because Cordy100, the #1 authority on hipster culture, has some very interesting things to say about jazz music and some of its greats, which I find a bit questionable as a jazz performer and enthusiast. This video is about 3 entries in his Rate Your Music list, the Hipster Collection, which cover 3 of the greatest minds of modern jazz: trumpeter Miles Davis, saxophonist John Coltrane, and bassist Charles Mingus. These 3 are unanimously considered to be some of the greatest players on their respective instruments, as well as 3 of the greatest pioneers which the genre of jazz has ever known. I'll get into the specifics of why that is soon enough. Let's start with Miles.
For people who never listened to jazz but found out how hip modern jazz is.
Or more accurately, for people who want to start listening to jazz and want a good place to start. Miles' 1959 album Kind of Blue is unanimously regarded as a hallmark of the genre, and it remains the best-selling jazz album of all time. Most people don't listen to jazz regularly, but most music enthusiasts will at least be able to recognize this album given its user-friendly material.
Davis is more present in the jazz hipster community, but they do not own exclusive property rights on him. The indie hipster will embrace him often as well, ignoring his own rule that high instrumental proficiency is a no-no. The I am eclectic and listen to practically every type of music hipster rule overrides the bare-bones minimalism with low levels of skill rule.
What the fuck is the jazz hipster community? It's not just jazz hipsters, or any other sort of hipster for that matter, that love Miles Davis. It's literally everyone who appreciates jazz to any degree. Even outside of the staying power of Kind of Blue, Miles is considered to be one of the most trailblazing musicians in any genre at any time in music history. He was at the forefront of cool jazz, modal jazz, and jazz fusion, and his contributions to music have cemented him as the most important trumpeter since Louis Armstrong. It doesn't take being a hipster to understand that.
I don't listen to jazz, apart from a little fusion jazz and DZ jazz here and there, because its aimless wankery bores me silly, which is why I can't comment on the music itself.
So why bother even talking about jazz? Again, I thought you were all about music above image. Surely if you can't comment on the music, you shouldn't be commenting on any aspect of jazz. And considering you refer to it as aimless wankery, I suppose I should be fortunate that you haven't said anything else about it.
And he collaborated with John Coltrane, a fact hipsters must take as some sort of confirmation of the rightness of their choice and the divinity of Miles.
Is it so surprising to Cordy that 2 of the most in-demand jazz musicians of their time crossed paths at some point? Plenty of popular musicians collaborate with other popular musicians. This really isn't anything new.
I spy with my little eye that the hipster album of choice by Miles Davis is Kind of Blue. Aren't I a brilliant amateur detective? To be frank though, I'll let you in on a secret. It has over 14,000 votes, a lot more than all his other albums. That's how I know, and how you identify a hipster album. These LPs collect dust in hipster homes the world over. If we could collect all this dust, we could make a full-sized Godzilla out of it.
Apparently, the secret to identifying a hipster album, at least in Rate Your Music terms, is to look for an album in an artist's discography which has many more ratings than all of the others. Kind of Blue has since amassed over 18,000 votes and an average of 4.27 out of 5. I mentioned this last episode, but do you really expect people to listen to music in the same way you do? Is it such a crime to have only ever listened to one album from a certain artist? And surely you don't think all 18,000 plus ratings came from hipsters. At least a few of them must have come from genuine jazz lovers, and a lot more of them probably came from people who genuinely enjoy Kind of Blue, even if jazz isn't typically their thing. A lot of people have genres they specialize in at the expense of familiarity with others. I don't blame these sorts of people for having only heard one Miles Davis album. I may be well more versed in jazz than they are, but they're probably a lot more well versed in electronic music or krautrock or 70s singer-songwriter music than me. That's the great thing about Rate Your Music. Everyone has a specialty and a unique set of likes and dislikes that you can have some interesting conversations about. Unless you're Cordy, that is. Next on the chopping block is John Coltrane, the man widely considered to be the greatest jazz saxophone of all time, including by me, the saxophonist. Here goes nothing, I guess.
If you have Johnny, Charlie, Mingus, and Miles Davis in your dust-collecting LP collection and no other jazz greats, you're a hipster. It's as simple as that. Furthermore, if you have the LPs of these 3 sandwiched between dozens of indie rock artists, You're so hipster that the best team of corrupt and powerful lawyers headed by Robert Shapiro and Alan Dershowitz couldn't absolve you from the felony charge of intent to hipstertize in front of a jury of biased pro-hipster art students while a bribed hipster judge presided. And if you have a complete DVD collection of Buñuel and Bergman films a few shelves away, including Battleship Potemkin, of course, from your dust-collecting LP collection, then you're a textbook example of a career hipster. A man dedicated to lifelong hipsterism, quite impossible to reform. Your chances of landing back to Earth and joining the rest of us are lower than Tom Cruise winning a Pulitzer Prize for cooking. Did I make myself clear? Don't come whining to me if this description fits your profile. I mean, if it's any comfort to you, things could be worse. You could be a serial killer.
Why do you expect people to be complete experts on every genre they listen to? Why is it such a terrible thing for people to merely have a passing knowledge of jazz? Surely it's better than nothing. You said yourself that you've listened occasionally to fusion jazz and easy jazz here and there. Where's the Sonny Rollins, McCoy Tyner, Art Blaker, and J.J. Johnson in your LP collection, huh? This bit of the rant, by the way, constitutes my Exhibit B of Cordy being really unfunny, Exhibit A being that Star Wars detour in his light white heat review.
So what's special about Coltrane? Why him? Is he really that much greater than all the other jazz greats, of whom there are quite a few? Why did hipsters single him out? Okay, there's Miles Davis and Mingus too, as I mentioned. They come as a triple package deal.
Gee, I don't understand what makes John Coltrane so special. I guess I never really thought about it. Could it be his incredible facility on his instrument, giving rise to the term sheets of sound? Maybe it was his use of a certain sort of chord progression that we call the Coltrane matrix, which helped to push jazz harmony beyond standard jazz progressions like the 2-5-1. Or, I don't know, maybe it was his further expansion on Miles's modal jazz concepts on albums like Africa Brass and A Love Supreme. Or, no, maybe it was his foray into the free jazz realm toward the end of his career. I mean, I guess I just can't put my finger on it.
I am not a jazz expert by any means, and come to think of it, neither are hipsters who fancy themselves experts simply because they own LPs by Miles, Chuck, and Johnny. Although I had listened to a lot of jazz when I was younger, but you don't need to be a jazz expert to answer those questions. You just have to read the man's biography and things will become pretty obvious. A retarded detective can figure this one out. You see, my dear hipster and non-hipster readers, John struggled with heroin and alcohol addiction, and he dabbled in hip, exotic religions such as Zen Buddhism, a Barbra Streisand favorite, and Indian religions. And John died very young. In other words, very, 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 very hipster material.
I mean, he also made some of the greatest music in any genre, period, of all time. Maybe that has something to do with it. How about we don't shame a man for becoming addicted to drugs at a time when so many people in his scene were using them as well? Does that sound good?
Now let's play the hypothetical game and take an opposite scenario from that one. Imagine a John Coltrane born in 1926, but a white man who lived to be 86, a devout Christian who never touched a drop of alcohol, always spoke out against drugs, and supported the Vietnam War, while still playing the exact same music as the real John Coltrane. Can you actually imagine that hypothetical John Coltrane being a hipster darling? Quite frankly, I don't think most hipsters would have even heard of him, let alone included him in their dust-collecting LP collections. The Vietnam connection alone would have completely disqualified him from becoming hipster royalty, let alone his waspishness. Hipsters are much like a modern-day extension of hippies in that sense. They're nearly all left-wing and detest Christianity by far the most out of all religions, despite the fact that all major religions, including the hip ones from Asia, have blood on their hands.
That version of Coltrane wouldn't be revered by hipsters because that version of Coltrane could never have existed. All of Coltrane's experiences, including those relating to his drug use, his open-minded approach to all religions, more on that in a second, and his identity as a black man during a time in America when black people were being racially segregated, played an extremely crucial role in the music he created. This white, Anglo-Saxon Protestant version of Coltrane you've invented for this scenario is based on the most shallow possible interpretation of Coltrane's work. And more to that point about hipsters supposedly hating Christianity, at the time that Coltrane recorded A Love Supreme, an extremely religious album and easily his best work, he was devoutly Christian. The entire album is most easily read as Coltrane giving thanks to the capital G Christian God, a god to which Coltrane felt he owed his thanks for the gift of music making. According to Cordy's logic, hipsters should be outright rejecting this album en masse, and yet over 14,000 RYM ratings and a 4.33 average. Something doesn't add up.
Hipsterism. It's all about image, alienation, angst, i.e. whining, class struggle, spirituality, preferably in an atheistic or at least a hip religion context, posing, shitty clothes, dumb hats, uniform politics in the sense that everyone has the exact same views, picky food habits, and lyrics. It's not about music. Coltrane must have been talented. I don't know, I'm not sure if I ever listened to any of his music when I was a kid. It's possible that I even know some of his stuff, unlike hipsters who only buy the stuff and wear his name on the internet as a badge of honor, but I don't doubt that he was a major jazz player. But whatever it is that turns any musician into hipster material has little to do with the music itself.
Is music not allowed to be concerned with things outside of just music? Art doesn't work like that. Art is often a response to the society in which it was created. That applies to Coltrane's body of work as well as jazz in general. It was a music born out of the struggles of an oppressed people. It is intensely political, and there is no escaping that. Coltrane has more than earned his place in jazz history, not just on the merits of the music he made, but the wider issues which his music stood for and signified. QWERTY, throughout this list, views music and other forms of art in a vacuum, devoid of the context in which they were made. The result? He won't bother consciously listening to John Coltrane, one of the greatest musicians of all time, purely because a bunch of people he disagrees with like Coltrane's music. That is just fucking pathetic.
Using Coltrane as an example, let me now explain to you how numbers divulge the extent of hipsterism. Album votes, to be precise. His 1965 album, the one every hipster considers his masterpiece, has over 11,000 votes on RYM, with a whopping average of 4.34. There are 2 to 3 other albums that have less than half that, around 5,000 votes. Then there is a mass of hipster-ignored Coltrane albums that only have around 1,000 to 2,000 votes, and many even less than that. So what do these numbers mean? Well, I spy with my little anti-hipster detective eye that one thing is certain. At least 6,000 people in RYM are hipsters who only checked out that one album, the hipster-approved album. Does it make sense to any normal/real/genuine music fan to discover one brilliant album from a musician but then choose to ignore all his other albums? Makes no sense, of course. Every genuine music fanatic would immediately prepare to check out some of the others, which is why you won't find nearly as much discrepancy in vote numbers from album to album when it comes to anti-hipster bands such as Iron Maiden or ABBA.
Up there goes the ABBA meter again. I knew it'd come in handy sometime. QWERTY, consider this. Not everyone listens to music the way you do. Not everyone needs to know everything about every artist they ever listen to. With a lot of jazz greats, this is incredibly common, since their output was extremely prolific. Coltrane put out more than a handful of albums every year from 1960 to 1967. You can't expect most people to be able to keep up with that, especially considering the current state of jazz music. I'll spare you the rest of QWERTY's rant about numbers.
So who are the real jazz fans? The real Coltrane fans? How many are there? They are to be found mostly among the 1,000 or so people who listened to and voted for his lesser efforts, not just the hipster-approved 1965 album or the 5,000-vote second-tier classics. Just this one example provides a wealth of clues just how rampant hipsterism is, and how much it is based on hype and a truly fascinating disinterest in music. Hipsterism is like a plague that rises exponentially. Obviously, the huge rifts in album votes are generally speaking much more drastic when it comes to indie bands. There you will usually find one album with 10,000 votes and the rest might only have 1,000. Why would those 9,000 people not check out other albums of their heroes? Because hipsterism isn't about the music. It's about very silly rules and underground hype.
Are you starting to notice how redundant QWERTY's writing style is? He's already complained about this a few times now. He just can't believe that people listen to music in their own individual ways. Now, I already mentioned that A Love Supreme is a very Christian album. Somebody actually pointed this out to QWERTY, thank goodness, prompting him to add this little addendum, which I would consider the funniest part of this list so far.
Post-commentary. I love giving hipsters the post prefix. A reader of this list suggested that I screwed up by saying that hipsters would never praise a Christian Coltrane, when in fact their fave album is a deeply spiritual Christian work. Now, while I admit that I didn't know this, after all, I don't have any hipsters helping me with this list, can you believe it? I do have to say that I wasn't entirely wrong. Firstly, Islam is said to have inspired at least part of the album. Secondly, hipsters forgive Coltrane his Christianity because a bulk of this music seems to be dedicated to, or at least inspired by black preachers. In other words, a hipster's oath to always be political correct overrides their disdain for Christianity.
Someone brought up some factual errors I made about A Love Supreme, so I checked some more information about Coltrane's religion on Wikipedia, and it turns out, based on these new hipster rules I made up, that I'm still right. It's so obvious to me that QWERTY is just shoddily covering his tracks here. I find it so beautifully hilarious. You know, sometimes it's just okay to concede that you're wrong and leave it at that. So can you tell that that one kind of struck a nerve? And we're still not even done here. Here's what he has to say about bassist, composer, and third stream innovator Charles Mingus.
What unites the only three jazzers that hipsters worship?
Aren't you forgetting Bad Bad Not Good and Kamasi Washington? That brings it up to at least 5.
Mingus, Davis, and Coltrane. What have they got in common that makes them hipster royalty while ignoring other jazz greats? Come on, try to figure it out. If you're a hipster, and you are, you bloody know you're one, you know the answer. No, not the fact that they're black. Otherwise you'd listen to Duke Ellington too.
Don't insinuate that I haven't listened to and played a lot of Duke in my time. To answer your question, the thing that unites these three is that they were all innovators. Miles had cool jazz, modal jazz, and fusion. Coltrane had the Coltrane Matrix and avant-garde jazz, and Mingus had third stream, which is a term coined by Gunther Schuller, which describes Mingus's music quite well. Basically, third stream combines elements of jazz and classical music into a sort of music which resists being called just one or the other. You can hear this on albums such as The Black Saint and the Sinner Lady, Let My Children Hear Music, and Epitaph. I get the feeling that this isn't really the answer Cordy is looking for, but it's the one that's actually correct, so I'm gonna stick with it.
The answer? They all played post-bop. Post is the hipster's fave prefix, the one that gives them the hardest boners.
Swing and a miss. I agree that genre labels and prefixes are kind of silly. Even the 3 jazz greats we've covered here would agree with that, but the problem with Cordy's insinuation here is that none of the 3 greats we've covered here played in a post-bop style for more than a few years. Miles pioneered the post-bop sound with his second great quintet in the early 60s, and some of Coltrane's or Mingus's output from the same time could definitely be said to be post-bop-like in nature, but they had all moved on from this by the end of the decade. Miles soon went on to spearhead the jazz fusion sound, Coltrane died in the middle of an artistic breakthrough in avant-garde jazz, and Mingus began writing music which rivals Mozart in its complexity. Cordy's assertions about the lives of these 3 musicians and the music they played are crumbling under the most basic amounts of scrutiny.
I shall check out his music as soon as I get in the mood to listen to hours of boring avant-jazz. Might take a while. Bear with me. Travel the world in the meantime, or write 14 novels.
Well, how do you know it's boring if you haven't listened to it? Never mind, if I'm not used to Cordy's presumptuousness by now, I'll never be. I think I need to unwind after this one. Up next for us is the OG hipster slacker Bob Dylan. Thanks for watching. Stay legend.
Thank you.